February 19th, 1945. The night sky over western Germany hung thick with clouds at 7,000 meters, the kind of darkness that German pilots had learned to trust like an old friend. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the void below, confident in what he knew to be true. The American bombers were flying blind tonight, their formations scattered and vulnerable in the moonless sky. What Weber and his fellow night fighter pilots did not yet understand was that they were the ones being watched, tracked by an invisible eye that would fundamentally transform the nature of aerial conflict. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how technological superiority shattered one of the most deeply held beliefs of the German air defense system, and how the certainty of veteran pilots crumbled in a single night when they discovered that darkness was no longer their ally. Friedrich Weber had been flying night operations for nearly 3 years. At 31 years old, he commanded a starful of Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighters based at Vector Airfield, and he had accumulated 17 confirmed victories against Allied bombers. His experience had taught him a fundamental truth about night combat. Visual contact was everything. The side that could see first would live. The side that remained unseen would strike. On this particular February evening, Weber received his briefing in the operations room at 2000 hours. The intelligence officer, a thin man named Lieutenant Klaus Richter, pointed to the maps with a wooden pointer, his movements practiced and confident. "The weather forecast shows complete cloud coverage from the Dutch border to the Rhine," Richter explained. "Visibility at altitude will be less than 100 meters. Any bomber formations attempting to penetrate will be forced to navigate by dead reckoning alone." Weber nodded, sharing a knowing glance with his wingman, Oberleutnant Hans Decker. Both men had flown enough missions to understand what those conditions meant. The American heavy bombers, the massive Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators, relied heavily on formation flying for mutual defensive fire. In weather like this, those formations would fragment. The bombers would be isolated, vulnerable, struggling to maintain course without visual reference points. "They will be blind tonight," Weber said with certainty. "If they come, they will come alone." Approximately 250 kilometers to the west, at a United States Army Air Forces base in eastern England, a very different briefing was taking place. Captain James Mitchell stood in a crowded room filled with B-17 crews, young men with faces that still showed traces of boyhood, despite the heavy responsibility they carried. Mitchell was the radar operator for a bomber designated as Baker 2-3, and he was about to explain a system that most of the men in that room still regarded with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "The H-2X radar set," Mitchell began, projecting his voice over the murmur of conversation, "gives us the capability to navigate and identify targets through complete cloud coverage. The scope displays a radar map of the terrain below us. Cities appear as bright returns. Rivers show as dark lines. We can navigate to the target and release our ordnance without ever seeing the ground." A pilot from another crew, a lieutenant whose name tag read Anderson, raised his hand. "Captain, with respect, how accurate can we be? We are talking about hitting industrial targets, not just general areas." Mitchell had heard this question before. The H-2X system, officially known as the AN/APS-15, was still relatively new to operational service. It had been rushed into production after the disastrous losses of 1943, when deep penetration raids into Germany had resulted in unsustainable casualty rates. The radar was heavy, weighing over 200 kilograms, and it occupied valuable space in the bomber that could have been used for additional ammunition or equipment. Many crews remained unconvinced of its value. "The resolution is not perfect," Mitchell admitted, "but it is improving with every mission. We have successfully bombed targets in weather that would have grounded us 6 months ago. Tonight, the targets are the synthetic oil refineries at Gelsenkirchen. The radar returns from those facilities are distinctive. We will find them." What Anderson did not ask, and what Mitchell did not volunteer, was that the H-2X had another capability that had nothing to do with navigation or bombing. The same radar energy that mapped the ground below could also detect aircraft. The system could see other planes, even in complete darkness, even through solid cloud cover. And on this particular night, that capability would prove more valuable than anyone anticipated. At 2100 hours, the first American bombers lifted off from their bases across eastern England. Over the next hour, more than 800 heavy bombers would take to the air, forming up above the perpetual clouds that blanketed the British Isles. They climbed into the darkness, their engines synchronizing into the deep rhythmic thunder that had become the sound of Allied air power. Weber and his Staffel were airborne by 2130 hours, climbing to their patrol altitude of 7,000 meters. The clouds below them formed an unbroken carpet of grey-black cotton, lit occasionally by distant flashes of lightning from a storm system moving in from the North Sea. The radio crackled with the calm, professional voices of German ground controllers, vectoring the night fighters into position along the expected bomber routes. Nachtjagd control to all stations. The controller's voice came through Weber's headset. We have preliminary radar contact with inbound formations, bearing 270 range, approximately 120 kilometers. Estimated force strength is heavy. All units to patrol sectors and await target assignments. Weber acknowledged the transmission and settled into his patrol pattern, flying a wide racetrack pattern between two radio beacons. Beside him in the cockpit, his radar operator, Feldwebel Ernst Zimmermann, hunched over the Liechtenstein SN2 radar display, watching for the telltale blips that would indicate bomber formations. The German Liechtenstein radar was a remarkable piece of technology for its time. It could detect aircraft at ranges up to 4 kilometers, giving night fighters a critical advantage in locating targets in darkness. But it had limitations. The radar was most effective when directed toward a general area by ground controllers. It required the operator to interpret the scope readings and guide the pilot into visual range. And most critically, it assumed that the enemy aircraft would remain unaware of being tracked. I have nothing yet, Zimmermann reported. The weather is creating too much ground clutter. Keep searching, Weber replied. They are out there. They were indeed out there. At that moment, more than 600 B-17 and B-24 bombers were penetrating German airspace at altitudes ranging from 6,000 to 8,000 meters. The formations, which had assembled over England in textbook precision, were beginning to fragment exactly as Weber had predicted. The solid cloud cover made station-keeping nearly impossible. Individual bombers drifted away from their groups. Their pilots focused on maintaining altitude and heading while avoiding collisions in the murk. But they were not flying blind. Inside Baker 2-3, Captain Mitchell sat at his H-2X radar station in the nose compartment, his face illuminated by the green glow of the scope. The display showed the German coastline as a bright, irregular line. Inland, the cities appeared as distinctive bright patches against the darker countryside, and scattered across the scope, moving in slow, deliberate patterns, were dozens of small returns that Mitchell recognized immediately. We have enemy night fighters all around us, Mitchell reported over the intercom. I count at least 20 contacts within our radar range. They are flying patrol patterns, probably waiting for ground control to vector them in. The pilot, Major Robert Carson, acknowledged the information with the kind of calm that came from flying 53 combat missions. Can you tell if they see us? Carson asked. Mitchell studied the scope, watching the movement patterns of the German fighters. This was where experience mattered. He had been tracking enemy night fighters since the H-2X system had been installed 4 months earlier, and he had learned to read their behavior. Negative, Mitchell said. They are still in standard patrol. If they had us on their radar, they would be closing in. Right now, they are waiting for their ground controllers to point them at us. This was the critical asymmetry that would decide the night's battle. The German night defense system was sophisticated and well organized. Ground radar stations tracked the incoming bomber streams and calculated intercept vectors for the night fighters. The fighters then used their airborne radar to refine the intercept and close to visual range. It was a proven system that had inflicted terrible losses on the Allied bomber forces, but the system had a fundamental vulnerability. It assumed that the bombers were passive targets, large and slow aircraft that could be tracked and hunted at leisure. The German controllers and pilots did not know that many of the bombers they were hunting could see them in return. that the Americans had radar operators watching the hunters as carefully as the hunters watched for their prey. At 2200 hours, Weber received his first vector from ground control. Comet 23, this is Nachtjagd control. We have a target for you. Bearing 285, range 30 kilometers, altitude approximately 7,000 meters. Single contact, likely a straggler from the main formation. Vector to intercept. Weber acknowledged and turned onto the assigned heading. Zimmermann activated the Liechtenstein radar and began searching the designated area. In the back of his mind, Weber felt the familiar anticipation that came before combat, the heightened awareness that turned the cockpit instruments and the darkness outside into a kind of expanded consciousness. The interception should have been routine. Weber had conducted dozens of successful attacks following this same pattern, but as he closed on the projected position, something unusual began to happen. The American bomber changed course. "I have lost the radar contact," Zimmermann reported, confusion evident in his voice. "The target has turned. It is no longer on the bearing that ground control provided." Weber frowned behind his oxygen mask. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. The bomber crew might have noticed something, perhaps a glimpse of exhaust flames. Or perhaps they were simply making a navigation correction. "Nachtjagd control, this is Comet 23, Weber transmitted. "Target has altered course. Request updated vector." There was a pause before the controller responded. "Comet 23, we still have the contact on our scopes. Bearing 290, range 25 kilometers. The target appears to be taking evasive action." Weber turned onto the new heading and increased speed. Zimmermann reacquired the target on the Liechtenstein scope. The distance began to close. 20 kilometers. 15. 12. And then the bomber turned again. "He is maneuvering deliberately," Zimmermann said, and now there was tension in his voice. "Every time we close, he turns away from us." Weber felt a cold sensation in his chest that had nothing to do with the altitude. In 3 years of night fighting, he had never encountered a bomber that seemed to anticipate his approach. Bombers flew straight and level to their targets. They did not execute evasive maneuvers unless they had visual contact with an attacker. And on a night like this, with complete cloud cover and no moonlight, visual contact was impossible. "Stay on him," Weber ordered. "He cannot know we are here." It must be coincidence. But it was not coincidence. Aboard Baker 23, Captain Mitchell watched his radar scope with intense concentration. The German night fighter appeared as a bright, distinct blip, and Mitchell could track every movement it made. When the fighter turned onto an intercept course, Mitchell immediately alerted Major Carson, who made subtle heading changes that broke the geometry of the attack. "He is coming around again," Mitchell reported, "bearing 015, range 11 kilometers, closing at approximately 100 knots relative." Carson turned 20 degrees to port and descended 100 meters, putting a slight angle into the bomber's flight path that would force the night fighter to adjust its intercept calculation. "The German pilot is persistent," Carson observed. "This is his third attempt." Mitchell allowed himself a slight smile despite the tension of the situation. "He does not understand what is happening," Mitchell said. "From his perspective, we are a blind target that keeps accidentally turning away at exactly the wrong moment. He probably thinks he is having bad luck." The irony of the situation was profound. The German night fighter pilot was flying with the confidence of a predator that had dominated its environment for years. The darkness that made American bomber crews anxious and fearful was Weber's natural element, the medium in which he was most dangerous. He could not conceive that his prey could observe him, track his movements, anticipate his attacks. Weber made 4 more intercept attempts over the next 20 minutes. Each time, the bomber altered course just as he approached within Liechtenstein radar range. Zimmermann grew increasingly frustrated with the equipment, convinced that the radar was malfunctioning, or that atmospheric conditions were causing unusual propagation effects. "This is impossible," Zimmermann finally said. "No crew can be this fortunate. They must have some kind of warning system, but what kind of warning system could function through solid clouds in complete darkness? Weber knew of no such technology. The British had developed radar, certainly, but radar was for ground stations and large ships. The idea of putting effective radar equipment in an aircraft was absurd. The sets would be too heavy, too power-hungry, too complex for airborne operation. These thoughts were interrupted by a transmission from Nachtjagd Control. All stations, be advised we are receiving reports of unusual evasion tactics from multiple interceptors. Several pilots report targets taking evasive action before visual contact is established. Continue attacks as directed. Weber felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February night air. If other pilots were experiencing the same phenomenon, this was not coincidence or equipment malfunction. Something fundamental had changed in the nature of night combat. Over the next 2 hours, the pattern repeated itself across the length of the bomber stream. German night fighters vectored onto targets found themselves engaged in a bewildering game of cat and mouse. The bombers they pursued seemed to possess an uncanny ability to turn away at precisely the moment when the fighter entered its attack range. Some fighters managed to close to visual range through sheer persistence, but the overall intercept success rate was drastically lower than normal. In the operations rooms of the German night fighter divisions, controllers watched their situation displays with growing concern. Under normal circumstances, they could expect their fighters to achieve intercepts on approximately 30 to 40% of the targets they engaged. Tonight, that rate had fallen to less than 15%. Bomber formations were reaching their targets and returning to England with substantially lighter losses than the weather conditions should have allowed. General Major Joseph Schmid, commanding the night fighter forces for the sector, received the preliminary reports at midnight. He was an experienced officer who had overseen the development of the German night defense system from its early improvisations to its current sophisticated state. He understood immediately that what he was seeing represented something more than bad luck or poor flying by his pilots. "The Americans have developed an airborne detection system," Schmid said to his operations officer. "There is no other explanation. They can see our fighters approaching even in total darkness." His operations officer, a major named Hartmann, looked skeptical. "Herr General, the technical requirements for such a system would be enormous. The power consumption alone would be prohibitive for a bomber aircraft, and the weight of the equipment would significantly reduce their bomb load." Schmid nodded slowly, his mind working through the implications. "All of that is true," Schmid agreed, "which means they have solved those technical problems. Consider what that tells us about their industrial capacity. They have resources sufficient to equip hundreds of bombers with sophisticated radar systems. They can afford to trade bomb load for defensive capability because they can simply send more bombers to compensate." This observation touched on something that went beyond the tactical situation of a single night's operations. The German military had been engaged in total war for more than 5 years. Resource allocation decisions were made with painful awareness of scarcity. The idea of installing heavy, complex radar sets in bomber aircraft would have been rejected immediately on grounds of cost and practicality. But the Americans apparently operated under different constraints. They could afford to be lavish with their technology because they had technological abundance. By 0200 hours, the bomber stream was turning for home. The targets at Gelsenkirchen had been hit with remarkable accuracy despite the weather. Post-mission reconnaissance flown 2 days later when the clouds finally cleared would show that over 60% of the bombs had fallen within 500 meters of their aim points, an unprecedented level of precision for a radar-directed attack. Friedrich Weber landed at Vector at 0330 hours, exhausted and frustrated. He had burned through nearly all his fuel in repeated unsuccessful intercepts. He had not fired his weapons once. As he climbed down from his aircraft, he found Decker waiting for him on the tarmac. "Any success?" Decker asked, though the answer was obvious from Weber's expression. "Nothing," Weber replied. "I had a target 5 separate times. 5 times it turned away before I could engage." "You?" Decker shook his head. "The same. Others are reporting identical experiences." "Something has changed, Friedrich. The Americans have a new capability that our intelligence completely missed." In the operations room, the debriefing was conducted in near silence. Pilot after pilot reported the same pattern. Targets that evaded before visual contact, attack opportunities that dissolved into futile chases, the sense of hunting an enemy that could somehow observe the hunter. Out of 47 intercept attempts made by the Staffel that night, Only 3 had resulted in confirmed bomber losses. The ratio was catastrophic. Weber sat in the mess hall afterward, drinking coffee that was more chicory than actual coffee, and tried to process what he had experienced. The certainty he had felt 12 hours earlier had completely evaporated. The darkness was no longer his ally. The invisibility that had made him dangerous had been stripped away by a technology he did not understand and could not counter. A few days later, German intelligence analysts began to piece together the details of the H-2X radar system, from interrogations of captured aircrews and from equipment recovered from downed bombers. The specifications confirmed Schmid's worst assumptions. The Americans had developed and deployed a sophisticated airborne radar that could map ground features for navigation and simultaneously track other aircraft in flight. And they had installed these systems in hundreds of bombers across their entire fleet. But the raw technical specifications told only part of the story. The deeper implication was strategic. The United States possessed sufficient industrial capacity to manufacture complex radar systems in quantities that would have been unthinkable for Germany. They could afford to equip their bombers with defensive electronics that weighed hundreds of kilograms and consumed kilowatts of power. They could sacrifice payload and range for survivability because they had so many aircraft that the reduction in individual bomber efficiency was more than compensated by the overall size of their force. For Weber and his fellow night fighter pilots, the night of February 19, 1945 marked a turning point. They continued to fly missions, continued to achieve occasional successes, but the psychological edge that had sustained them through years of combat had been broken. They were no longer unseen hunters stalking blind prey. They were participants in a technological arms race that their nation was steadily losing. Weber survived the war and was captured by British forces in early May 1945. During his interrogation, an Allied intelligence officer asked him to identify the moment when he first believed that Germany would lose the air war. February 19th, Weber answered without hesitation. The night the Americans showed us that darkness was no longer enough. When we learned that they could see us as clearly as we hoped to see them, but with better equipment, better training, and unlimited numbers. We were still brave. We were still skilled. But we were fighting an enemy that had so much industrial power they could afford to give every bomber its own radar set. How do you fight that level of abundance? The intelligence officer noted down the answer, recognizing that he was recording something more significant than tactical information. This was the testimony of a skilled professional describing the moment when his expertise became insufficient, when individual courage and training could no longer compensate for systemic, technological, and industrial inferiority. The H-2X radar system represented more than just a new piece of equipment. It was a manifestation of the fundamental economic reality of the Second World War. The Allied powers, and particularly the United States, possessed industrial capacity that could produce advanced technology in quantities that overwhelmed any defensive response. The German forces could innovate tactically, could develop sophisticated defensive systems, could field pilots of extraordinary skill and experience, but they could not match the sheer volume of technological capability that the Allied war machine could generate. By late March 1945, German night fighter losses had increased to unsustainable levels, while their success rate against bombers continued to decline. The combination of American radar technology and the overwhelming numbers of Allied aircraft meant that the night skies over Germany, once the domain of the Luftwaffe night fighters, had become increasingly dangerous for the defenders and relatively safer for the attackers. The final irony was that Germany had its own scientists and engineers who understood radar technology, who could have developed similar systems if given sufficient resources and time. But resources were scarce, time was short, and the industrial capacity that could turn laboratory prototypes into thousands of operational units simply did not exist. The gap between knowing what was possible and being able to produce it at scale was the gap between the opposing sides' industrial capabilities. Friedrich Weber spent the last weeks of the war on the ground, his unit having been dissolved due to lack of fuel and replacement aircraft. He watched the final collapse from an airfield that had been bombed so many times that operations were no longer possible. When British troops arrived to accept his surrender, they found him methodical and professional, a career military officer, acknowledging defeat with dignity. Years later, interviewed by military historians researching the night fighter campaign, Weber was asked if there was a single moment that stayed with him from the entire war. He thought carefully before responding. February 19, 1945, he said, "Flying through absolute darkness, convinced of my advantage, certain that my prey was blind and vulnerable, and slowly realizing that I was the one being watched, that they could see me, track me, anticipate me. That moment when certainty turned to uncertainty, when the predator realized he was also prey. That is what I remember most clearly. Not the fear exactly, but the sudden understanding that everything I thought I knew about night combat had become obsolete in a single night. The Americans were not lucky. They were not guessing. They were tracking us with technology we did not know existed and could not counter. That was when I understood how the war would end. The H-2X radar system continued in service with the United States Air Force for several years after the war ended. The technology developed for the system influenced the next generation of airborne radar, contributing to systems that would transform aerial combat throughout the jet age. The fundamental principle, that whoever can see first in darkness has the decisive advantage, remained constant. But the larger lesson was about industrial capacity and technological abundance. The ability to manufacture sophisticated electronics in quantities sufficient to equip entire bomber fleets demonstrated a level of economic power that would characterize American military capability throughout the Cold War and beyond. It was not simply about having advanced technology, but about having the industrial infrastructure to produce that technology at scale and the economic strength to deploy it lavishly. For the German night fighter pilots who experienced that February night in 1945, the revelation was permanent. They had trained extensively, fought courageously, developed sophisticated tactics, and they had encountered an enemy that could simply overwhelm their advantages through technological abundance. Individual skill and bravery could not compensate for systemic industrial superiority. The night when Friedrich Weber claimed the Americans were blind, only to discover that American radar was locked on and tracking his every move, became emblematic of a larger truth about modern warfare. Victory increasingly belonged not to the side with the bravest soldiers or the most clever tactics, but to the side that could bring superior technology to bear in sufficient quantities to dominate the battlefield. The H-2X radar was just one example, but it was a telling one. It showed that the United States could afford to be technologically lavish, could equip individual aircraft with systems that represented significant engineering and manufacturing investment, because the industrial base supporting those aircraft was so vast that such expenditures were sustainable. This was the reality that Weber grasped on that February night, flying through the darkness and gradually understanding that his invisible enemy could see him clearly, track him precisely, and evade him consistently. The confidence of years of experience dissolved into the recognition that the war had moved beyond the realm where individual expertise mattered most. It had become a contest of industrial systems, and Germany was fighting enemies whose industrial capacity was so overwhelming that they could afford to put advanced radar in every bomber, could accept the weight and power penalties, could sacrifice some payload and range because they had so many aircraft that the aggregate bombing capacity remained devastating. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.